The explosions had been going on for 2 hours. Not close enough to kill, close enough to feel. Each depth charge sent a shockwave through the hull, metal groaning, bolts vibrating loose. The lights flickering with every blast dot inside Soviet submarine. B-59, the air was nearly unbreathable. The temperature had climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were rising. Men were passing out. The captain was shouting. And in the torpedo room, one weapon was armed and ready. Nuclear, 10 to 15 kilotons. Enough to vaporize the American ships above them. Enough to start a war that would kill hundreds of millions. 2 officers had already voted yes. 1 man stood between that decision and detonation. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. And this is the story of the vote that saved the world. But to understand what happened in that steel tomb at the bottom of the Caribbean ... we need to go back 36 hours. October 27, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Day 13. The world had been watching for nearly 2 weeks as the United States and the Soviet Union circled each other like fighters in a ring. Soviet missiles in Cuba. American blockade around the island, both sides armed. Both sides waiting for the other to blink. The public didn't know how close it was. The diplomats were still talking. Kennedy and Khrushchev were still exchanging letters. It looked tense, but manageable. What the public didn't know was that 4 Soviet submarines were already in the Caribbean, diesel-powered, running silent. Each one carrying a single nuclear torpedo. Their mission: break through the American blockade, escort Soviet supply ships to Cuba, show strength. Don't back down. But the mission had already gone wrong. The submarines had left their base in the Soviet Arctic weeks earlier. The journey to Cuba was long thousands of miles through cold northern waters, then down into tropical heat. The subs were designed for northern operations. Not this. By the time they reached the Caribbean, the heat was unbearable. The diesel engines generated more heat. The cooling systems couldn't keep up. Inside the subs, the temperature climbed into the triple digits. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. And then the Americans found them. U.S. Navy destroyers. Dozens of them, equipped with sonar, hunting. And when they found a Soviet sub, they did something that terrified the Soviet crews. They started dropping depth charges. Not the kind designed to sink a submarine. Practice depth charges, smaller explosives, designed to force a submarine to surface, to identify itself, to stop hiding. The Americans called them warning charges, a signal. Come up. Show yourself. We know you're there. But the Soviet submarine crews didn't know that. All they knew was explosions all around them, getting closer. And no communication from Moscow. No orders. No confirmation of whether war had started or not. In the cramped, overheated, suffocating interior of submarine B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky made a decision. If the Americans were attacking, he would fight back with everything he had. Vasili Arkhipov wasn't supposed to be on B-59. He was 36 years old. A Soviet Navy officer, experienced, disciplined, and carrying a reputation that made other sailors uneasy. 1 year earlier, Arkhipov had been second in command aboard a different submarine, K-19, a nuclear-powered vessel on patrol in the North Atlantic. On July 4, 1961, K-19's nuclear reactor cooling system failed. The reactor core began to overheat. If it melted down, the sub would explode, or worse, poison the entire crew with radiation and sink. The captain ordered a repair team into the reactor compartment. Men went in knowing they'd absorb lethal doses of radiation. They went anyway. They jury-rigged a cooling system using whatever they could find. They saved the ship that 8 men died within days from radiation poisoning. More died later. K-19 limped back to port, leaking radiation, barely afloat. Arkhipov survived. But he'd been inside that reactor compartment. He'd breathed that air. He'd absorbed radiation, and he carried it with him, physically and mentally, for the rest of his life. That experience changed him. It taught him something about chain reactions, about decisions made under pressure, about the difference between bravery and recklessness. In October 1962, Arkhipov was given a new assignment. Not as captain of a submarine, as flotilla commander, the officer overseeing multiple submarines in the same mission group. That meant he'd travel aboard one of the subs in the group. As an observer, as senior authority. He chose B-59. And that choice accidental, bureaucratic, routine would matter more than anyone could have predicted. October 27, 1962. Late afternoon. Caribbean Sea. B-59 was trapped. American destroyers had surrounded them. 11 ships, all equipped with sonar, all dropping depth charges. The submarine had been submerged for hours. No communication with Moscow. No way to know if war had started. No way to know if the explosions were warnings or attacks. Inside the sub, conditions were catastrophic. The temperature had climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Some areas near the engines were even hotter. Men stripped to their underwear, soaked in sweat, gasping for air. The carbon dioxide scrubbers machines that remove CO2 from the air were struggling. CO2 levels were dangerously high. Men were fainting. Some were hallucinating. Medical supplies were running low. The submarine had been designed for northern waters. Cold. The crew had packed winter uniforms. Now they were dying of heat in the tropics. And every few minutes, another explosion. Another depth charge. Closer. Louder. Captain Savitsky had been awake for nearly 2 days. His nerves were frayed. His judgment was slipping. He believed genuinely. Believed that war had started. That the Americans were trying to sink them. And that Moscow had probably already launched. He made his decision. Prepare the special weapon. That was the code phrase. The special weapon. The nuclear torpedo, Soviet submarine protocol was clear. Nuclear weapons could only be launched with authorization from 2 officers. The captain and the political officer. Captain Savitsky. Yes. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov. Yes. 2 votes. That should have been enough. But B-59 wasn't like other submarines. Here's what most people misunderstand about that moment. The story is usually told like this. Vasili Arkhipov was the lone voice of reason, a hero who stood against 2 other officers and refused to let them launch. One man's courage stopped World War III. That version is dramatic and partly true, but it misses the deeper mechanism, the thing that actually saved us. Because Arkhipov didn't just refuse out of moral courage. He had authority that the other officers didn't. The hidden mechanism. Standard Soviet submarine procedure required 2 officers to authorize a nuclear launch. The captain and the political officer. 2 votes. Launch. But B-59 had a 3rd officer aboard. Vasili Arkhipov. The flotilla commander. Flotilla commanders weren't supposed to interfere with individual submarine operations. They were observers, coordinators, not part of the command chain. But Soviet naval regulations had a quirk, a bureaucratic detail that no one had thought much about. When a flotilla commander was physically aboard a submarine, He held equal authority to the captain on matters involving nuclear weapons. That meant B-59 didn't operate under the standard 2-vote rule, that it operated under a 3-vote rule. Captain. Yes. Political officer. Yes. Flotilla Commander Arkhipov. His. Vote mattered. And if he said no, the launch couldn't happen. It wasn't heroism alone. It was a quirk of Soviet bureaucracy, combined with one man's clarity under unimaginable pressure. The torpedo room was small, hot, loud with the sound of explosions. Outside, Captain Savitsky stood near the nuclear torpedo, armed, ready, targeted, at the American ships above them. "We're going to blast them now," Savitsky said. His voice was hoarse, exhausted, desperate. "We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." Political officer Maslenikov nodded. He'd already agreed. 2 votes. Arkhipov stood across from them, calm, or at least calmer than he should have been. He'd been through worse. K-19, the reactor meltdown, radiation, men dying around him. That experience had taught him something about panic, about decisions, made when you think you're already dead. And right now, everyone in that submarine thought they were already dead. Arkhipov spoke quietly, firmly. "We don't know if war has started. We have no communication with Moscow. The Americans haven't fired. On us only depth charges. We're being signaled to surface, not destroyed. If we launch, we guarantee war. If we wait, we might survive." Savitsky stared at him, furious, humiliated. "We're under attack. We're being pressured to surface," Arkhipov interrupted. "That's not the same thing." The argument went on for minutes. Voices rising, the crew watching. Some wanted to launch. Some were too exhausted to care. The explosions kept coming, and then Arkhipov said something that changed the equation. "I survived K-19 by not making the fastest decision. I survived by making the right one. This isn't the right one." Silence. The mention of K-19 carried weight. Everyone knew the story. The reactor, the radiation, the men who died. Savitsky looked at the torpedo, then at Arkhipov, then at the hull vibrating with each explosion. Finally, he spoke. "We surface. What we know for certain, from later accounts and interviews with B-59 crew members, is that Arkhipov refused to authorize the nuclear torpedo launch, and that his refusal was decisive. The exact words and sequence vary depending on the source, but the outcome is CLEARB-59 surfaced. When the submarine broke the surface, the American ships surrounded it immediately. Destroyers, aircraft overhead, cameras. The Soviets expected to be sunk or boarded or arrested. Instead, the Americans signaled, "Identify yourself." B-59 ran its DIESEL engines to recharge batteries. The crew opened hatches to let in air. Fresh, cool air. Men gasped. Some cried. The Americans didn't fire. They watched, took photos, recorded. And after a few hours, B-59 submerged again and left the area. The crisis continued for a few more days. But the moment when a nuclear weapon nearly detonated in the Caribbean, the moment that could have triggered world, War III had passed, quietly, without the world ever knowing how close it came, according to declassified Soviet naval records and crew accounts from the 2002 conference in Havana, where B-59 survivors spoke publicly for the first time. The vote structure aboard B-59 required 3 officers to agree on nuclear weapons use because Arkhipov was aboard as flotilla commander. That proves the bureaucratic quirk was real 3 votes, not 2, but it doesn't prove that the same quirk existed on all Soviet submarines with flotilla commanders aboard, or that it was consistently enforced. Soviet naval protocols were often ambiguous. What we know is, on B-59, on October 27, 1962, it mattered. Here's the part that makes this even more terrifying. B-59 wasn't the only Soviet submarine in the Korean at day dot. There were 3 others. B-4, B-36, B-130, all equipped with nuclear torpedoes, all being depth-charged by American destroyers, all isolated, all overheated, all under the same pressure dot. We know what happened on B-59 because crew members talked about it decades later. Archipov's decision became public, but what happened on the other 3 submarines? Did they come as close? Did they have similar votes? Did they have officers who said no? The records are still incomplete. Some details remain classified. But we know this. None of them launched, which means either they all made the same rational choice as B-59, or they got lucky in ways we'll never fully understand. The fact that 4 submarines, 4 crews under unbearable conditions, convinced they were under attack, armed with nuclear weapons, all chose restraint. That's not just one hero. That's a systemic miracle. Vasili Arkhipov was never publicly honored by the Soviet Union. His role aboard B-59 was classified for decades. The Soviet Navy didn't want to advertise how close they'd come to a nuclear exchange. Didn't want to reveal the chaos, the confusion, the vote that almost went the other way. Arkhipov continued his naval career, rose to the rank of vice admiral, trained younger officers, lived quietly. He died in 1998. He was 72 years old. Most of the world didn't know his name. It wasn't until 2002, 4 years after his death, that B-59 crew members spoke publicly at a conference in Havana about the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's when the full story emerged. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, said afterward, "The lesson from this is that a guy called Vasili Arkhipov saved the world." But Arkhipov's widow, when asked about her husband's decision, said something quieter, something more accurate. He knew what nuclear consequences meant. He'd seen it. He didn't want to be responsible for that again. K-19 had taught him the cost of chain reactions, of decisions made too fast, of assuming the worst and in the torpedo room of B-59. That knowledge saved us 3 lessons. First, authority structures can accidentally save you or kill you. The 3-vote rule on B-59 wasn't designed to prevent war. It was a bureaucratic quirk, a detail about flotilla commanders. That happened to create an extra layer of decision-making. That quirk saved the world, but it just as easily could have killed us. If the 3rd officer had voted yes instead of no, we build systems, command chains, protocols, and we assume they'll behave rationally. But systems are only as good as the people inside them, and people under pressure make unpredictable choices. The lesson isn't trust bureaucracy. It's understand that safety nets are often accidental and fragile. Second, experience with catastrophe changes how you see risk. Arkhipov had survived K-19. He'd watched men die from radiation. He'd seen what happens when a reactor melts down, when systems fail, when decisions are made too quickly. That experience didn't make him fearless. It made him cautious. When everyone else in the torpedo room saw certain death and chose to fight back, Arkhipov saw uncertainty and chose to wait, not because he was braver, because he'd already lived through a catastrophe and learned that panic accelerates disaster. In high-stakes situations, the people who've already been through hell are sometimes the steadiest. Not because they're fearless, because they know what hell looks like. And they know how fast it arrives when you rush the decision. Third, the votes that prevent wars are never unanimous. Savitsky wanted to launch. Maslenikov agreed. Arkhipov said no. 2 against 1. If the rule had been majority vote, we'd all be dead. In groups under extreme pressure, consensus is dangerous. It feels like strength. Everyone agrees, so it must be right. But sometimes the most important voice is the dissenting one. The officer who says, wait. The person who refuses to go along. The vote that stops momentum. Democracy in a crisis isn't always about majority rule. Sometimes it's about protecting the right of one person to say, not yet. Let me think. And giving them enough authority that not yet actually means something. Vasili Arkhipov understood something that saved us twice. Once on K-19, when the reactor melted down and he helped jury-rig a solution instead of panicking. And once on B-59, when he refused to authorize a weapon that would have started World War III. He understood that the moments when you feel most certain you're about to die are exactly the moments when you need to slow down. But Arkhipov wasn't the last person to stand between us and a nuclear accident, because the weapons didn't disappear. The systems didn't get simpler. And the next time it almost happened, it wasn't human error that nearly killed us. Was the opposite. A computer. A training tape loaded at the wrong time. And 6 minutes to figure out if the world was ending. That file is next. That's the story history tried to hide. I'll see you in the next file.